What is meant by the term rectification of names?
If Confucius were here today, he would surely be aghast at the way inflated language seems to have taken over ordinary conversation. I was so tired I was literally dead on my feet. No, you weren't, he might say. Drop the literally and your expression will have far more impact, even though your surrounding culture insists that more is better. He would be amazed to hear restaurant staff introduce themselves as your food and beverage counselor, or hear store cashiers and stockers identified as sales associates and inventory specialists. But Confucius would worry less about such trivial matters than about the very same deep social issues he agonized over in his own time. When a man fails to show respect to his parents, do not call him a son. If he fails to guide his children, he is unworthy to be called a father. If a woman does not attend to her family faithfully, one can hardly call her a wife or mother. If a man is unfaithful to his wife, do not call him a husband. Of greatest political import is his insistence that no unjust ruler deserves the name emperor. Beneath this apparently nitpicking criticism, Confucius was getting at a profound truth: over the long haul, imprecise speech allows injustice to go unnoticed because it can be hidden behind acceptable names. Euphemism can erode one's sense of right and wrong and desensitize a person to violence. Eventually we persuade ourselves that misspeaking is not a lie, or that stealing is nothing more than the redistribution of wealth. Confucius believed that language matters because it not only reflects, but can even change, the way we think.
How is music important in Shinto ritual?
Gagaku, refined music, is ancient courtly music originating in China as early as the Han Dynasty and cultivated by the Japanese in Heian imperial circles. Often associated with dance, the 14-member instrumental ensemble consists of percussion and reeds. But it also includes the stringed instrument similar to the Hawaiian guitar called the so, cousin of the larger koto, identifiable by its frequent use of the technique of note bending. A plucked string called the baiwa is also part of the ensemble. Woodwinds are the three reeds, sankan, short, piccolo-like 6 and 9-hole flutes. A primitive oboe-like woodwind that produces a sharp, edgy sound. And a cluster of 17 bamboo pipes called the sho that is in fact a tiny pipe organ for the mouth. Slow stately rhythms beat out by the percussion underlie the haunting, almost plaintive sounds of the high-pitched reeds. Few sounds are a more apt musical communication of the sense of solemnity and perfect otherness of the deities the music addresses in Shinto shrines. Most non-Japanese who encounter music identified as Japanese are likely to associate that musical tradition with the sound of plucked strings, such as the koto and shamisen. In Shinto shrine ritual, however, Stringed instruments do not play the major role they play in Chinese ritual. Percussion and woodwinds make up the bulk of the typical ceremonial ensemble. Percussion instruments include the massive taiko, a large barrel with two skin heads that sit sideways on an elevated stand just inside the outer ritual hall of larger shrines. A shrine ritualist, often one of the miko, deaconesses, announces the beginning of ceremonies by a pulse-pounding crescendo-decrescendo on the great drum. Various smaller drums keep time for dances.
What was the religion of the Maya?
The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica grew out of a very early agrarian way of life. Beginning around 2500 BCE in the tropical rainforest lowlands of northern Guatemala, the area now known as El Petén. Maya civilization has been divided into 5 periods, beginning with the formative period. Around 1500 BCE and ending with the arrival of the Spaniards in the 16th century. Religion was a major part of the everyday lives of the Maya. With more than 160 different gods, the Maya spent much time fasting, praying, and offering sacrifices to the deities in hopes that they would bring rain and good crops, good health, and good luck. The universal creative force was referred to as Hunabku. And the towering ceiba tree was called the Axis Mundi, or Tree of Life, which was thought to reside in all 3 levels of the cosmos. Roots in the underworld, Zibalba, trunk in the middle world, and branches in the heavens. Trees were thought to represent the sustainer of life because of their role in rain cycles. And the Maya believed that when the last tree disappeared, so would the people. The Maya had a corn god, a rain god, a sun god, and a moon goddess, among many others. Each god or goddess influenced a specific part of Maya life. For example, the goddess of the moon, Ninchel, was said to control medicine and weaving. In the great ceremonial centers, priests and priestesses were often involved in vision-producing rites that would supposedly allow them to communicate with the gods. Maya carvings and paintings show men and women ceremoniously piercing parts of their bodies to shed blood and induce higher states of consciousness. Women often pierce their tongues and men their penises, using stingray spines, flints, or thorns. Blood was dripped onto bark paper and the paper was burned as an offering to the gods. Humans, often captured enemy warriors, were ritually sacrificed to appease the gods. The victim would be held down upon an altar and a priest would slit his chest under the rib cage and tear out the heart. Stone carvings of a reclining figure known as the chikmul, which is pictured holding a bowl or platform for a bowl, were thought to be receptacles for sacrificed hearts or blood. Captives were also tortured, bled, and decapitated. Some sacrificial victims were tossed into deep natural water holes, cenotes, to plead with the rain god for water. When an important person or ruler died, his servants were often killed and buried with him.
Do people ever decide they want to depart from Daoism or CCT?
Membership in Daoism and CCT has rarely, if ever, been a matter of exclusive allegiance. Members of some major religious traditions, such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and, to a lesser degree, Hinduism, typically regard belonging as a kind of all-or-nothing affair. Either you're in, or you're out. Disagree with major tenets of the tradition, or neglect consistently and willfully to fulfill the minimum ritual and ethical requirements of the faith community, and your membership is in question or has lapsed altogether. Religiously involved Chinese generally do not think about membership in those terms. Belonging is deeply rooted in national and local culture, integral to the very fabric of society. Individuals who drift away from regular religious practice have not necessarily left, so long as they have not entirely cut themselves off from family and social connections. Other family members might express regret that sons or daughters no longer find the traditional ways helpful and have chosen to delete that part of their heritage from their self-identities. And many today sense the gradual diminishment of traditional values and practices precisely because of this sort of attrition. But Chinese, whether Daoist or CCT, generally do not think in terms of leaving the faith, unless they do so with the intention of converting to a missionary faith, such as Christianity. In those cases, people do talk of leaving behind unacceptable beliefs and practices.
Are doctrine and dogma important to Shinto practitioners?
Shinto has been influential in Japanese life through a relatively small number of specific and well-defined beliefs. Ancient tradition teaches the sacredness of nature and of the existence of specific individual and personal divine beings, including those mentioned in myths. Some of those divine beings have had universal importance throughout Japan and the history of Shinto. Others have been of more regional or local importance. The teaching with perhaps the most significant cultural implications is that of the divine ancestry of the emperor. Other important elements of the myth that one could call doctrinal have to do with the divine origins of Japan itself and the essential need of ritual purity. Across Japan and over the centuries, many other doctrine-like features have been important. But Shinto never has been a dogmatic tradition in that it has not explicitly made adherence to a specific set of doctrines a standard for membership in the community of believers. Far more significant has been the standard of participation in community through its vast complex of ritual practices. Those rituals are in turn deeply rooted in the primal myth.
Who are Vajrayana Buddhists?
Vajrayana Buddhism consists of a number of schools and lineages that blended Mahayana concepts with the esoteric interpretations of Hinduism's tantric schools. Local pre-Buddhist elements of shamanism and folk religion gave further distinctiveness to the different schools. In some places, Vajrayana, also called Tantrayana, esoteric vehicle, has blended with popular traditions. In the monasteries, the monks and mystical adepts engage in arcane rituals open only to initiates. But the monks also minister to the public through more accessible teaching and worship. Monastic institutions have dominated much of everyday life in the Himalayan nations and, until recently, to a greater degree than elsewhere in Asia. Many of the largest and most powerful monasteries are perched high above cities and villages, so that their physical setting is itself an unmistakable symbol of their centrality. Before the Chinese takeover of Tibet, as many as 1 out of 5 Tibetans were monks or nuns. Some half a dozen major monastic orders developed, of which the Dalai Lama's Gelugpa order is now the best known. Vajrayana Buddhists developed their own extensive sacred scriptures, largely by way of translation of Indian Sanskrit and Chinese texts. In 108 volumes, the Kanjur, translation of the word, includes monastic regulations along with philosophy. The 225-volume Tanjur, translation of treatises, includes sutras, tantras, and commentaries on them. Perhaps most distinctive of the various Vajrayana schools is the use of special ritual symbolism and meditative techniques to achieve their spiritual objectives. Visualization techniques and highly developed forms of chanting assist the meditator toward union with the divine center. Outside Tibet and the other Himalayan nations, Vajrayana tradition exercised considerable influence on the increasingly esoteric Japanese Shingon school.
What was the movement known as iconoclasm and why was it important?
The iconoclastic, from the Greek for image breaker, controversy arose in the early 8th century CE and lasted until 842 CE. For centuries Byzantine Christianity had used sacred icons. But Emperor Leo III called the practice into question on the grounds that it prevented Muslims and Jews from converting. Leo's order that all icons be destroyed provoked turmoil throughout the Church, both politically and theologically, with monks and their monasteries taking most of the punishment for refusing to submit. 60 years after Leo began the controversy, the Second Council of Nicaea in 787 reversed his decrees. But within less than 30 years another Leo, the Fifth, returned to his namesake's policies with a vengeance, severely persecuting iconodule, those who supported the use of icons. The theological sore point was the argument that people who venerated icons were ever on the brink of idolatry. Their counter-argument was that icons were merely symbolic of the sacred realities beyond them. Though the controversy did considerable damage and cost a surprising number of lives and careers, the Eastern Church recovered from it rapidly and has suffered no challenge of its kind since.
What is the freedom of religion in the 20th century?
In March of 1981, after more than 30 years of failed attempts, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights completed a draft declaration on the elimination of all forms of intolerance and of discrimination based on religion or belief. After approval by the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, the declaration was adopted by the General Assembly on November 25. 1981. The declaration is a short document with 8 articles. It states that no one should be subject to discrimination on the grounds of religion or belief. That such discrimination should be condemned as a human rights violation. That states should act to prevent and eliminate such discrimination, and that the parents or legal guardians of a child have the right to organize life within the family in accordance with their religion or belief. Although religious liberty was deemed to be better protected by underspecification than by overspecification, the Declaration does enumerate 9 freedoms. Article 6 describes the right to freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief as including, but not limited to, the following freedoms: to worship or assemble in connection with a religion or belief and to establish and maintain places for these purposes. To establish and maintain appropriate charitable or humanitarian institutions. To make, acquire, and use to an adequate extent the necessary articles and materials related to the rites or customs of a religion or belief. To write, issue, and disseminate relevant publications in these areas. To teach a religion or belief in places suitable for these purposes. To solicit and receive voluntary financial and other contributions from individuals and institutions, to train, appoint, elect, or designate by succession appropriate leaders called for by the requirements and standards of any religion or belief. To observe days of rest and to celebrate holidays and ceremonies in accordance with the precepts of one's religion or belief, and to establish and maintain communications with individuals and communities in matters of religion or belief at the national and international levels.
Do deists and practitioners of CCT believe in heaven and hell?
Since long before the beginnings of religious Daoism, the notion of heaven, Tian, as an impersonal transcendent reality has been very important to the Chinese. Some deists have identified heaven as the first materialization, or a kind of emanation, of the Dao's spiritual power. In this sense, heaven becomes an intermediary between the unmanifest Dao and all of creation. For heaven is the source of all good things. Along with earth and humanity, heaven is one of the 3 powers that bring about life as we know it. However, deists do not generally talk of heaven as the eternal abode of those who lived virtuously on earth. One region beyond ordinary earthly experience is the Isles of the Blessed, Pen Lai Shan. In the far reaches of the Eastern Sea, where the 8 immortals dwell amid an idyllic landscape. Many Chinese express the hope of finally reaching the Isles and attain immortality there. Belief in retribution after death for a less than praiseworthy life has given rise to a wealth of imagery. But Daoism and CCT call hell a multi-storied earthly prison. There are 10 levels of hell. Some prefer to talk of 10 separate hells, each with its ruling deity. They function rather like the circles of hell in Dante's Inferno, each designated for those who commit specific sins and crimes. Presiding over the first level is a sort of chief judge, who wields authority over the other 9 judge kings. Some souls never make it to their assigned hell, a difficult passageway to the hope of better things beyond that. They spend eternity wandering aimlessly and forever hungry, dependent on the kindness of the living to attend to their needs. Some sources talk of hell much as many Christians describe purgatory as temporary suffering with long-range benefits.
What is a Sufi?
The word Sufi seems to derive from the Arabic word for wool, suf, pronounced suf. Among the first generations of Muslim Sufis were ascetics, spiritual athletes who strove to detach themselves from whatever distracted them from worshipping God. Garments of rough wool symbolized their desire for a simple life. Some of these early ascetics gained a reputation, often much to their personal consternation, for holiness. But some early seekers of deeper spirituality found ascetical discipline and self-denial an unsatisfactory path. A woman of Baghdad named Rubi'a, d. 801, pronounced Raabia, gave expression to a fierce longing for God in bold, shocking love poetry. How dare a mere mortal talk of a loving relationship with the infinite God? Rubi'a was the first true mystic, an inspiration to many who would risk all to communicate the unspeakable. Some, like Hallaj, d. 922, would die for their presumptuousness. Accused of blasphemy and fatally misinterpreted, thus sharing the fate of mystics in many traditions. People everywhere sought out these spiritual beacons for guidance and blessing. Communities gathered around some prominent Sufis and eventually developed into formal organizations called tariqas, pronounced ta'ariqa, meaning path. Over the centuries, dozens of major Sufi men and women have left a legacy of poetry, arresting insight, and leadership. Jalal ad-Din Rumi, d. 1273, the original whirling dervish, is one of the more famous classical Sufis. Translations of his poetry now ranking among the best sellers in the United States. In some parts of the world, such as the Central Asian republics that made up the southern tier of the former Soviet Union, Sufi orders have been responsible in large part for the very survival of Islam through very difficult times. Many international Sufi organizations now maintain websites. Some teach that one does not need to be a Muslim to be a Sufi. but it is nevertheless important to keep in mind that Sufism is a genuinely Islamic phenomenon.
What does the term revelation mean in Islamic tradition?
Islam's scripture, the Quran, consistently refers to itself as the word that God has sent down. Tanzil, pronounced Tanzeel, to humankind through Muhammad. That which is sent down represents a manifestation of truths that have existed from all eternity in the heavenly archetype of the Quran known as the mother of the book. God reveals by communicating in a language understandable to the intended audience. Both the Quran and subsequent Muslim tradition describe the actual process of revelation by a technical term, wahy, that distinguishes prophetic revelation from the kinds of inspiration that animate holy persons and artists, for example. The prophetic intermediary hears the message not with physical ears but with the ears of the spirit and heart. Some descriptions of revelation suggest a visionary dimension as well, as when the angel Gabriel or another mysterious unnamed presence appears. According to both Quran and Hadith, Muhammad received revelations in a wide variety of circumstances. In some cases revelation is given in response to a particular question asked of the Prophet. In others, Muhammad is described as praying, preaching, eating, or even bathing. Muhammad is said to have experienced a variety of actual sensations when he received a revelation. He spoke of a sound like bees humming around his face, or a loud bell, the sound of which was physically painful. Sometimes he broke into a cold sweat or showed signs like those of a trance or seizure. All of the prophets are said to have experienced similar forms of revelation. What is most significant here is Muhammad's overwhelming sense of the divine presence at these moments.
Why do Muslims bury their dead so quickly?
Although there's no time limit, most Muslims are buried within 24 hours of their death. The tradition originated out of the practical need to keep bodies from deteriorating in the Middle Eastern heat. Although many Muslims now live in countries where technology allows bodies to be preserved, most avoid embalming, because they believe it violates the dignity of the deceased. For the very same reason, Muslims don't believe in displaying a body as is common at many Christian funerals.
What are some other important celebrations for Daoism and CCT?
Daoists observe days special to the three officials, or officers or rulers, whom CCT call Shun, Yao, and Yu, on the 15th days of the 1st, 7th, and 10th lunar months. Their days are associated respectively with heaven, earth, and water. The heavenly official, Shun, ranks highest and remains very popular in Taiwan, for example. The water official, Yu, is celebrated for having saved the world from uncontrolled flooding. Three deist deities considered at the pinnacle of the pantheon are known as the three primordials. Their festival days coincide with those of the three officials, respectively. The first two of which also coincide with the CCT Lantern Festival and Ghost Festival.
What are the main Islamic notions of the afterlife?
Muslim eschatology has much in common with most Christian and some Jewish traditions about the afterlife. Death is not the end of life, but a transition to another level of existence. Muslims believe human beings are accountable for all of their free moral decisions. People are not held similarly responsible for actions with negative consequences but done under duress or in the absence of intent to do evil. Numerous texts of the Quran warn of the coming day of judgment. The day of resurrection, the hour in which the true quality of everyone's deeds will be revealed. On the basis of that accounting, individuals will go across a narrow passage of no return called the Barzakh, pronounced Barzakh, to one of several destinations. Paradise is called the garden, Jannah, pronounced Jannah. A verdant place of repose and delight, an oasis for the just. Heaven is not so much literally a place as a state of being whose principal feature is the vision of God. Quranic texts refer to several different levels or degrees of heavenly reward. Hell, known as the fire or Gehenna. Jahannam, pronounced Jahannam, represents the state of refusal to acknowledge God's sovereignty. Some Muslim theologians have taught that hell is not necessarily a permanent state, since God can always forgive any sin except unrelenting denial of God's existence. Hell can thus function in a way similar to that of the state of purgatory in Christian tradition. Though Islamic tradition does not have a separate term for that state of purification. Muslim tradition also hints at something like an intermediate state, perhaps similar to the Christian idea of limbo.
Do Hindus believe in angels?
Nothing in Hindu lore corresponds exactly to the spiritual beings known in some traditions as angels. But a host of lesser deities, called devatas, and spirits make up the entourages of many of the major deities. These versatile beings are often grouped in families whose mission is to do their deities every bidding. Like the angels in some traditions, lesser deities fill the spiritual air around the major deities. In popular spirituality, devotees often consider the need to render an account to these divine vanguards nearly equal to their duties to the central deity. For the lesser deities preside over essential areas of life such as fertility, childbirth, and disease. Those that wield more positive energies have their darker counterparts that need to be appeased in order to hold evil at bay. Among the more common beings of this rank are the door guardians, Dvarapalas, who keep undesirable elements out of temples and away from the shrines of the deities to whom they are assigned. Door guardians are often depicted with iconographic clues very similar to those of their major deities. So, for example, guardians in a Vaishnavite temple typically have 4 arms and are equipped with Vishnu's conch shell, discus, and mace.
What was the specific occasion on which this particular text was revealed to Muhammad? Was it revealed in connection with any unusual or momentous event? Was it a direct response to some question or predicament that had arisen in the early Muslim community?
Contemporary Muslims can dip into an enormous reservoir of traditional scholarship for help in interpreting the Quran. Exegetes began compiling detailed and extensive commentaries on the sacred scripture as early as the 8th century. They refined the tools of a specialty called tafsir, pronounced tafseer, explanation, elaboration. Dozens of multi-volume works in Arabic, plus countless more in various other languages, of great antiquity and authority are still widely available from publishers of Islamic books. And many are now being translated into Western languages. Classical commentators and modern-day interpreters alike look first to the Hadith for help on obscure passages of the Quran. For Muhammad himself often responded to questions about specific texts. Careful study of Arabic grammar and a wide knowledge of other works of Arabic literature for purposes of comparison are also essential background for professional exegetes. In addition to elucidating the basic or literal meanings of a sacred text, Quran commentary can also probe into further levels of meaning. Muslim mystics especially have written allegorical or symbolic interpretations, called ta'wil. Pronounced ta'wil, to uncover the deeper spiritual implications of the scripture.
But why not opt for mute adoration? Why choose to complicate matters by multiplying hopelessly inadequate attempts at capturing divinity?
Because that is an important part of being human. People need to talk about the sources of greatest wonderment, as well as about their hopes and fears and suffering. At the risk of being accused of idolatry, a charge non-Hindus often level at them. Hindus acknowledge a fundamental need for imagery. All religious traditions finally do something similar. Even the traditions that sound the loudest alarm about the dangers of idolatry. Judaism and Islam, for example, use extensive and vivid verbal imagery to say the ineffable. Most Hindus, like certain Christian and Buddhist communities, for example, include a wide array of visual expression side by side with the verbal. Words can become idols, too.
What is the difference between a prophet and a sage?
Biblical prophets and sages arose from similar backgrounds and cultural circumstances, but had different ways of describing the relationship of the human and the divine. First, their overall purpose, call it strategy if you like, differed in several ways or strategy. Prophets spoke for God, focused on divine justice, and were motivated by the divine word and by a conviction of God's presence. Sages spoke for humankind, addressed human reason, and were moved by social conscience. The prophet's rhetoric was fiery and animated, idealistic, and meant to engage people's emotions, while that of the sages was cool and dispassionate, practical, and aimed at persuading listeners by the strength of the argument. Finally, prophets and sages directed their messages at different publics. Prophets struggled urgently to make God known to the rich and powerful, in the hope that they would modify their ways of ruling others. Sages sought through steady pedagogy to help ordinary people apply knowledge to their daily lives.
Is there a standard Confucian group liturgical worship?
Confucianism is surely among the most ritual-conscious traditions in history. Each day in the life of a Confucian is full of an awareness of the importance of ritualized actions and ways of thinking. But apart from the larger annual or semi-annual public ceremonies, and the regular acknowledgement of revered ancestors, there is no communal Confucian liturgy as such.
Do Hindus believe in miracles?
A special quality of Hindu belief generally is that all things, whether spiritual or material, result from the divine play or lila. God brings all things into being, sustains them for a time, then withdraws them from the realm of human experience, not by laboring, but as a kind of divine entertainment. That does not mean that God is cynical or cruel, dangling his creatures like so many marionettes. It means only that what we know as our world is the product of God's delight. Hindu tradition teaches that human beings are the beneficiaries of that delight. We are, in other words, invited to the party. The concept of miracle presupposes that human beings already know the limits of ordinary causality. From the Hindu perspective, that assumption is the height of arrogance because it suggests that human beings have things pretty well figured out, such as the causes and cures of disease, the roots of evil, and the wellsprings of good. One of the many aspects of the Hindu tradition's genius, and one of its major contributions to humanity, is that it refuses to close the door on surprise. All things, not merely the odd event that appears to defy the laws of nature, are cause for wonder. There is but one great miracle. God has chosen eternally to pour out the divine essence in its countless forms and enjoys doing so. What a gift of the ultimate perspective on life! To see it all as part of one great marvel and learn not to take oneself so seriously.
What is the difference between a sermon and a homily?
In general, sermons tend to be longer and organized around a doctrinal or moral theme. Homilies may be lengthy, but they are generally situated in the context of a larger liturgical service. Whereas sermons as often as not are the main focus of a worship gathering. Sermons frequently take as their subject a line or somewhat longer passage from Scripture. The homily form seeks to comment on and elucidate a pair or set of scriptural texts. Precisely as Scripture and not so much as a springboard for an ethical discourse. The preacher typically chooses the sermon's signature passage because of its theme, rather than because the text has come up in due course as part of a prearranged cycle of readings. Homilies are more often a way of helping the congregation appreciate how the selected readings fit together and comment on each other, and how they fit in the larger scheme of the liturgical cycle for the season at hand, such as Advent/Christmas, Lent/Easter, Ordinary Time.
What problems did Reform Judaism attempt to solve?
Many German Jews of the early 1800s began to feel that the tradition-bound approach of Orthodox Judaism was losing touch with life in rapidly changing societies. Reform, alternatively called liberal or progressive, leaders began by seeking to adapt prayer and liturgy to the needs of people less able to follow them meaningfully in Hebrew. Ideas from the Enlightenment, Haskalah, that informed further developments were Moses Mendelssohn's 1728-86, Principles of Rational Religion, the existence of God, divine providence, and the immortality of the soul. Reform was a grassroots movement initiated by lay people and only later enjoying rabbinical support. A student of Mendelssohn, David Friedlander, 1756-1834, launched the movement by replacing Hebrew prayers with German and replaced the Jews' plea for the restoration of Israel with hope for global renewal. Samuel Holdheim, 1806-60, took liturgical reforms further in Berlin. And, with Abraham Geiger, 1810-74, instituted dramatic changes. Sabbath worship moved to Sunday, with no gender separation, kippah, prayer shawl, or shofar. Their radical program of assimilation also rejected dietary laws and circumcision. Geiger led a gathering of rabbis in 1837, arguing for a much reduced authority for both Bible and Talmud. He believed Judaism was a world community rather than an ethnically based nation. The World Union for Progressive Judaism is the movement's international umbrella organization. Several important developments have marked Reform Judaism in the United States. Reform theology regards Scripture as divinely inspired, rather than directly revealed verbatim, and subject to the interpretation of each individual. In 1885 the Pittsburgh Platform altered ritual practice by doing away with strict dietary regulations and ancient codes of priestly purity. Reform Jews believe in the immortality of the soul, but not in bodily resurrection. Numbering about 2 million, they are the largest Jewish community in the United States, gathering in some 900 synagogues or temples.
What is the philosophy of religion?
Some philosophers make a specialty of inquiring into the reasonableness of religious belief systems. As far back as Thomas Aquinas, d. 1274, in Europe, Ghazali, d. 1111, and Ibn Rushd, d. 1198, among medieval Muslims, the Hindu Shankara, d. 820, and even back to the Buddhist Nagarjuna, c. 150 to 250, and earlier, religious thinkers have tackled questions of how much truth reason can grasp. Thomas Aquinas' classic 5 proofs for the existence of God are among the most famous inquiries of this type. Philosophers of religion provide a great service in their attempts to keep religious language and truth claims honest, along with philosophical attempts to give a rational justification for religious beliefs, a subspecialty in the philosophy of religion deals with the intricate analysis of various forms of religious expression. It analyzes religious language, ritual, and statements of belief as to their rationality. Virtually every major religious tradition, at some periods during its history, has developed alongside of philosophical schools that have acted as gadflies or devil's advocates.
Why was the Emperor Constantine important in Christian history?
After learning the protocols of the Roman court by serving under Diocletian, Constantine, c. 274 to 337, consolidated his power in the Eastern Empire around 312 CE. Tradition says Constantine underwent a dramatic conversion to Christianity around that time. The following year he met with his Western counterpart, Emperor Licinius, at Milan, and the two concurred on a formula for what would become Christianity's political enfranchisement. In a dramatic about-face in the fortunes of its adherents all over the empire, Christianity now had power on its side. Thenceforth, whenever dissension within the ranks of Christians led to violence, the mainstream could enforce its views by appeal to the emperor. Under Constantine, Sunday officially became a religious holiday for Christians. Constantine has the further considerable distinction of having convened the first of many ecumenical councils, that of Nicaea in 325, though he was as yet unbaptized. The emperor presided over the debates concerning a claim by Arius, c. 250 to 336 CE, that Jesus was a human creature, not eternal and divine. Bishop Athanasius. c. 296 to 373, made the case for the Orthodox response to Arius' heretical views. 5 years later, Constantine tightened his grip on the empire, established his capital at Byzantium, newly renamed Constantinople, city of Constantine, and went on to become known among Orthodox Christians as the 13th Apostle.
How are Shinto leaders chosen and given authority?
Shinto priesthood has historically been a hereditary occupation. Even after the government officially took over the appointment of chief priests after 1868. Hereditary succession continued in many localities. Perhaps the most important ingredients in maintaining standards among Shinto officials are the two educational institutions now solely responsible for the training of priests. Tokyo's Kokyugakuin, National Learning University, is a relatively recent development. A private university that offers general education as well as the equivalent of Shinto seminary curriculum. It supplies research for the present centralized shrine authority, the Jinjiya Honcho. The Kagakin, Imperial Hall of Learning, University near ISE, was originally a public institution that closed after World War II and then reopened in 1952 as a private university. Priests to be study Japanese history and literature, but focus on Shinto studies, especially ritual and theology. Shinto priests are not ordained clergy, strictly speaking. They are laypersons granted certification or licensure upon satisfactory completion of the seminary curriculum and its qualifying exams.
What are the major types of deist religious observance?
Deist sources talk about 3 levels of ceremony. Great services called qiao, which occur relatively infrequently. Ritual gatherings called fanhui, and feast days called ten. 2 essential features of every religious celebration are the preparation and the actual event. Zai refers to several types of purifying fast. Strictly speaking, the Zai is preparatory to the main ceremonial event, the offering or qiao, but certain distinct actions set the purification apart. Both celebrants and their sacred space need to be prepared ritually. To purify both mind and body, participants meditate in solitude, eat vegetarian meals, fast for a time, and refrain from sex. Preparation may commence as much as 3 days ahead for the major feasts, and continue through the main event itself. Celebrants prepare the sacred space through a combination of actions, including chanting and burning incense. A category of events called jiao includes various kinds of festivities. In ancient times, the principal jiao were associated with planting and harvest. Eventually, various deist sects incorporated elements of the time-honored traditions into their liturgies. But the agricultural element became secondary. Different groups compiled extensive collections of liturgical rites in massive tomes, with specific ceremonies for a wide range of occasions.
What other early sacred texts are especially important for deists?
A text known as the Zhuangzi, named after the man whose disciples may have authored it, dates from about the 4th century BCE. The work is also known as the Divine Classic of Nanhua. The town to which Zhuangzi was believed to have retired. Zhuangzi, the deist philosopher, c. 389–286 BCE, remains a relatively little-known figure. But the work that bears his name stands out as a foundational document in philosophical Daoism, whose interpretation of basic concepts also influenced many religious deists. In addition to its bold attacks on the inadequacy of Confucian teaching, the Zhuangzi presents essentially the same worldview as the Dao De Jing. Especially the importance of non-effort, wu wei, or unmotivated action and its political implications. Zhuangzi emphasizes the concepts of longevity and immortality that would later take on great significance for many religious deists. Perhaps more important is the concept of mental purification called fasting of the heart. Zhuangzi's teaching has become an important element in deist mysticism, speaking often of a kind of oneness with the Dao. A deist philosopher named Li Zi is likewise said to have penned a work that bears his name. That book, also known as the true classic of the expanding emptiness, however, was almost certainly of a later time, and Li Zi is probably a legendary figure, containing materials of many different literary types, especially narrative forms such as anecdotes and parables. The book was probably compiled around 300 CE. Its 8 chapters arrange their literarily disparate materials thematically, addressing such topics as fate and human freedom, problems in establishing ethical standards, and the challenge of following the Dao. Here for the first time we hear of the Isles of the Blessed, home of the immortals. Like the Zhuangzi, the later work speaks at length about the complete freedom experienced in becoming one with the Dao.
Were early Christians persecuted by Rome? How long did that go on?
As Christianity became more clearly separated from its Jewish roots, Roman authorities all over the Mediterranean became more wary of Christianity's potential threat to Rome's authority. Many Christians refused to burn incense to the emperor and paid with their lives. But executions remained largely a matter of local jurisdiction until about the middle of the 3rd century. Several Roman emperors, such as Nero and Marcus Aurelius, were known for their personal antipathy to Christians. But it was Decius who in 250 CE issued the first general order requiring all in the realm to worship the gods of Rome. Thousands of Christians were executed and many more renounced the faith, at least publicly. Diocletian, 284 to 305 CE, began his reign with greater tolerance. But toward the end sanctioned the razing of churches, the burning of scriptures, and wholesale executions. The reign of terror continued until 311 CE. When Emperor Galerius proclaimed a renewal of official toleration of Christians.
What is a schism?
Schism comes from a Greek word, schismos, that means a rupture, break, or tear. Though strictly speaking the term has been used technically to refer to events in the history of Christianity. It can also be useful in understanding similar changes in other traditions. A schism occurs when a faction within a larger religious community decides to break away and assert its independence from the main body. Impetus for a separation may also originate with the parent group censuring a minority and demanding that they either change their position or depart. The result can be the creation of more than two subgroups. Reasons for schisms are often ostensibly doctrinal, one group insisting that it cannot affirm some religious claim that the main body has declared essential to membership. However, since all theological issues ultimately have social and political implications, such changes are seldom purely theological. Ethnic divisions have been responsible for a number of important schisms. Some schisms have resulted in the formation of whole new religious traditions as, for example, Christianity's emergence from Judaism or Buddhism's development out of Hinduism. Other yield sub-traditions that continue to identify themselves as members of the larger religious community. But just as often the parent group wants nothing further to do with the schismatic group. And the feeling is frequently mutual.
Have there been important Buddhist mystics?
If transforming encounter with mystery and the cultivation of mental and spiritual states beyond everyday awareness counts as mysticism, then Buddhist tradition can certainly claim its mystics. But there are important differences between Buddhist mysticism and those of traditions such as Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity. All three of those traditions talk of at least two large categories of extraordinary spiritual experience. In theistic or dualistic mystical experience, the human person meets the divine other but retains his or her individuality. In monistic or cosmic mysticism, the human person becomes one with or realizes the oneness that already exists in an ultimate reality, with no trace of individuality surviving. Buddhist teaching insists that there is no self to begin with, so neither of those two models quite fits. True, some Buddhist schools use the language and symbolism of deity and union. But they understand those symbols as meditative aids rather than representations of metaphysical realities.
What kinds of special ritual objects figure in Buddhist worship and prayer?
Among the most common implements used in regular ritual are acoustic devices such as bells, gongs, and hollow wooden blocks. Prayer leaders will occasionally strike a large bronze bowl-shaped bell set on a pillow. As its vibrant, mellow ring decays into silence, devotees recall the universal characteristic of impermanence. When ritual leaders, sometimes accompanied by the congregation, chant sacred texts, they generally strike a hollow block of wood rhythmically to keep chanters together in their recitation. Incense burners and containers of sand into which devotees can insert their lighted incense wands are part of nearly every ritual setting. Sometimes devotees will approach a temple's large incense cauldron, waft the smoke toward them with their hands, and then rub it on various parts of their bodies for healing and general well-being. Esoteric sects typically employ a larger variety of objects. Tibetans use a small scepter symbolizing the indestructibility of the thunderbolt in one hand. The other holds a small bell whose vanishing sound represents impermanence. Some groups use weapons associated with Hindu deities who became part of the Buddhist pantheon. Some also use a begging bowl, as the Buddha did, or a fly whisk, symbol of adherence to the Dharma. Most basic among the ritual objects in both home and temple are the candle holder. 1 for the home, 2 in temple, flower vase, 1 at home, 2 in temple, and small censer. Other common objects include tablets or scrolls containing sacred names or mantras, either in Sanskrit or the vernacular.
What is a prophet?
Especially important in the traditions of Middle Eastern origin, prophets play two indispensable roles. First, prophets are intermediaries in the divine communication to humankind. In the Abrahamic traditions, prophets speak on behalf of God, sometimes delivering a sacred scripture to the people to whom they are sent. In this capacity, prophets appear often through history, whenever the divine revealer determines that the original message has been lost or has become so diluted as to need restatement. In addition, prophets function as critics of the ethical and religious status quo. They confront the powerful with a mandate to establish justice for all their subjects. They challenge the wealthy to account for their responsibilities in societies where the gap between the haves and the have-nots grows ever wider. They remind ordinary people of the need to render thanks to the divine source of life and giver of all gifts.
How did the teachings of Confucius spread?
Very soon after his death, the followers of Confucius initiated what would become a centuries-long process of elevating their teacher above the ranks of ordinary people. They revered him as a special ancestral figure, the pinnacle of wisdom. They built a temple in his honor in Khufu in 478 BCE and, not long after that, began to enshrine statues and paintings of the teacher and his major disciples there. Official imperial exaltation of Confucius did not begin until nearly 5 centuries after his death. After Han Emperor Ping proclaimed Confucius the exalted Mt. Ni Duke of highest perfection in the year 1 CE, a dozen other sovereigns followed, bestowing similar accolades down to at least the 16th century. In keeping with the hierarchy of royal titles, the emperors decreed that Confucius would be known by such titles as Duke, First Teacher, First Sage, High King of Learning, and Ultimate Sage. Around 1530 CE, emperors stopped using the language of royalty and switched to a set of titles designed to reflect wisdom rather than temporal power. As early as the mid-5th century CE, the imperial authority dedicated a temple to Confucius, and within a century or two decreed state-sponsored offerings in the master's honor. Though Confucians have never considered Confucius divine, he has clearly ranked at the very zenith of human perfection.
Has Confucianism ever been intimately identified with specific political regimes?
Confucian teaching offers a great deal of reflection on the nature of an orderly society and methods of governing. It is therefore not surprising that a number of political regimes have chosen the Confucian system as their official ideology. Emperor Wu Di, r. 140–87 BCE, of the Han Dynasty, 202 BCE 220 CE, was the first to do so, paving the way for a long and complex association between Confucian teaching and Chinese government. In Korea, Confucianism became the official religion of Korea by decree of the Yi, 1392–1910, dynasty in 1392, to Buddhism's detriment. Leaders condemned Buddhism's view of this world as illusory and argued for the more humanistic approach of Confucian tradition. Perhaps the most far-reaching result was that education toppled from its elite pedestal and became available to a wide public. Confucianism took somewhat longer to forge its links to the Japanese imperial government. During the Tokugawa period, 1600 to 1868, after the capital had moved to Tokyo, Confucian tradition enjoyed its closest association with Japanese imperial rule. Particularly in the realm of international relations, the legacy of Confucian political thought stood out. Confucians played an important role in the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which involved a restructuring of imperial administration. as the Japanese grew to regard Confucianism as an unwelcome import. The tradition's official influence in governmental circles diminished steadily.